Yahweh, in a single assault, killed 70,000 people. Entities is a word that probably makes mainstream Christian believers a little uncomfortable, because they're very comfortable with the traditional translations of the kinds of entities that are in the Bible. So they're used to talking about God and the devil and Satan and angels and demons. And one of the problems with that is that it doesn't describe our experience, our lived experience. People have anomalous experiences, close encounters, and there's no language available there to describe what's happening. So that's one problem. But the other problem is that those translations don't do justice to the spectrum of entities in the Bible. So we come to the Elohim, and we're used to seeing that word translated as God or gods, but it can be translated as landlords or chieftains. It can refer to angels, and it can refer to negative entities. Why is there that great elasticity? So the Elohim is the Bible's earliest word that gets translated as God. There's an entity called El Shaddai. People are used to hearing that translated as the Almighty. But if you go to the most authoritative lexicons like Brown Drivers Briggs, or to very transparent Bible translations like the New Jerusalem Bible, they'll tell you squarely that's an invented translation. It really means the powerful one, the destroyer. Then we have El Elyon, the powerful one, more powerful than the other powerful ones, is essentially what that means. And then we have Yahweh, which is a word with no meaning. It's a mystery word with no etymology in the Hebrew language. Again, we have to watch how that entity behaves to work out what's going on there. We have entities who have names, like Asherah and Dagon, who are beings remembered by the ancients for their tutelage in agronomy. These beings came from far away, came to the planet, and taught our ancestors how to become farmers and how to build civilizations. We read words like angels, and we think we know what it means, except it hasn't told us what kind of entity we're looking at. The word angel just means something on a mission or on an assignment with a message. And we look at how some of those behave, and you and I would begin to think, hang on, we have a different word for that in the 21st century. And if you leave some of these key words untranslated, just leave them as they are in the text, look at how they behave, and you'll begin to recognize patterns of arrival from outer space, arrival through portals, flying technology, military technology, new information provided to humanity. And you realize that we've got a whole sequence of close encounters and experiences of first contact being described. So Jacob's ladder, with these beings arriving from space, landing, going back up into space through a hole in the sky, or Elijah being taken away in a chariot of fire through a whirlwind wind, or the Ruach flying around, creating vortices of wind and terraforming the devastated planet. There are all these clues there that we're looking at the arrival of forces with technology who are now going to interact with our ancestors, and our ancestors have to interpret what's going on with the language they had at the time. Our ancestors are all saying with one voice that no understanding of the world is complete until we understand that there is a non-human layer to the governance of our planet. And so they're telling us how things were for them, but they're giving us a lens through which to understand current reality. Hayam Eshed, the Brigadier General who for 28 years was Israel's Chief of Space Security, he made an amazing statement in 2020 saying that we've been in contact for more than 70 years and that there's a galactic federation in place that is moderating project, or oversighting at the very least, Project Earth. And when he said that, he is saying what is happening in the present is the same as the Celts was describing in 17th century Scotland, as the Hawaiians were describing in the stories of the Mo'o centuries ago, as you can hear an African story from out of Nigeria, from the Yoruba people, the Edo people, the Efik people, the Dogon people of Mali. They all have these stories of contact with rulers in the past who are non-human, and the suggestion is there this is how you understand geopolitics in the present. You have to recognize all these layers, that you've got visible leaders and then elites who pull strings, and then above the elites is this non-human layer who have certain parameters that they're setting for Project Humanity. And our human experience should mean that we shouldn't be naive to company. We will understand that you can have allies and you can have enemies, and that sometimes diplomacy has to be a subtle thing. You need to calculate who's on your side, but how powerful are they? How helpful can they be against the others? And I think our own experience of invading each other's countries ought to give us some kind of shrewd awareness of what exopolitics might look like. I think the conversation that's happened in the last 12 months in Washington, this stoush between members of Congress and the Pentagon over secrecy around the program, it frames everything as a military threat. And I think that distorts the picture. I think we need to be having a more layered and subtle conversation about who are we in contact with and how do we move forward? What agreements are in place? Do we need to review them? Certainly, there have been agreements in place since the 1940s, since the Truman administration, and I go into that a little bit in the Invasion of Eden. Do we need to look at that again? And can we please bring the light of a bit more scrutiny and accountability to what is happening? I have an old-fashioned belief in democracy that scrutiny actually helps decision making. If I say the word alien, a lot of people will think immediately Mars attacks, Independence Day, and there have been moments in our story that would seem to have been rather like that, and many of the Yahweh stories fit into that scheme. In fact, there is a whole group of visitors referred to in the Bible as the Tseva Hashemayim, the sky armies. So that gives you an idea of whether or not they came in peace. Well, Yahweh was part of the sky armies. And we have details given of the technology that he used, the flying technology, the spacefaring technology, which you can find in 1 and 2 Kings, in Ezekiel, in Exodus. And when you get into Ezekiel, you have this prophet being flown around in this craft, and we have descriptions of the textures that he's feeling, the feelings of G-forces, the sounds of the engine when it flies, and then the details of the weapons that are carried on this craft, which is called the Ruach, the wind maker, or the Kavod, the glory. And then he's shown a Keli Mapaso and a Keli Mashetal. And he's shown that 6 individuals equipped with one of those. One is translated as the shattering thing, and the other as the disintegrating thing. And 6 individuals equipped with one of those each can ethnically cleanse an entire district. And just to give you a sense of scale as to what that might be, World Trade Center was attacked. 2,996 people died. And that was a huge shock to the USA. Nothing like that had happened on American soil before. Europeans a little bit more familiar with attacks on that scale. D-Day, I think it was over 10,000 infantry killed on a single day. Londoners, a bit more familiar with attacks on a bigger scale. During the Blitz of London, between 40,000 and 43,000 Londoners were killed. Yahweh, in a single assault, killed 70,000 people. That dwarfs those other destructions, and that was in a single assault, which he made on his own infantry. And he did that as a message for one person. That was for an audience of one, his puppet king, David, as a message to him, you don't think about questioning my orders. All David had done was count his army, which is a very sensible thing to do if you're going to calculate whether to go to war or not. But Yahweh is saying, no, your only calculation is if I tell you, you go. End of story. You don't need to know how many troops you have. And counting his troops was too close to questioning orders. And he could respond with, one action, 70,000 people dead. So I don't think you can read the Yahweh stories as stories of something benevolent that was looking after his people group. It was a story of wars between Yahweh and other Elohim and thousands of people left dead through the years of those conflicts. In a lot of Bibles, the name Yahweh is translated as the Lord, with Lord in capitals. So unfortunately, when Christians read the Hebrew scriptures and see the Lord, naturally they think these are stories of God. But you go back to the beginning of Christian history, and there were plenty of really central church fathers who said the Yahweh stories and Elohim stories cannot be understood as God's stories because they are morally incompatible with the teachings of Jesus. The behavior of the entity Yahweh is incompatible with Christian morality. So in a sense, Christians should have a head start here, recognizing that we've got narratives of some other kind of contact going on, but that translation confuses it. The moment you leave Yahweh untranslated and go and read those stories, you will start evaluating the moral behavior of that entity, and there's no way you will conclude that the theos about whom Jesus taught had anything to do with the Yahweh of those old stories. And it's a bit of a smoking gun that in all the Gospels and New Testament, neither Jesus nor anyone who writes for him ever uses the word Yahweh as a word for God. And there are plenty of places where Jesus distances himself from Yahweh. You've heard it said, but I say this. Moses allowed you this, but I say this. And then there's a famous moment where he says, what kind of father, when his children are asking for food, would give them a stone or snakes? And he's referring to a moment when Yahweh did exactly that to the starving tribes of Israel. If Jesus had been a worshipper of Yahweh, then Christians today would be Yahwists, all following Yahweh's law. But as soon as you've read as far as Acts 15, you realize Christianity isn't built on Yahwism. If Jesus had been a Yahwist, the Jerusalem Council could not have come to the decision it did in Acts 15, which was to say we're not building Christianity on faith in Yahweh's laws or the stories surrounding him. So really it's a story of discontinuity between these experiences of violent colonization by entities including Yahweh and what Jesus was teaching about. He taught about theos, which is the Greek concept of God, the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being, which we're all offspring. That's the Apostle Paul's definition of theos. Jesus uses that word. He refers to theos as pater, which means father. He addresses the source as Abba, which means dad or sir, a word in between those. But he never once takes the word Yahweh on his lips. So I'm convinced it's a story of discontinuity, and it makes sense once you begin reading the Paleo contact narratives and understand that the Yahweh stories fit in the pattern of invasion stories that you can find told by cultures all around the world. Elevating this Yahweh character into God, and in the Eden conspiracy I show how that happened, means you've just empowered your kings and queens and emperors to use violence and force and brutality to manage their own societies and invade other people's countries, because they can do all that in the name of God, because isn't that how God behaved? Once we disentangle this and realize, yes, there are God stories in the Bible, but the Elohim and Yahweh stories are something else, we break the chain of that logic. And I think the real harm that's done by keeping it as it is that Christians are taught systematically to ignore their consciences and to ignore the obvious and to pretend they're not seeing in the texts things that are blindingly obvious. And once you've done that to people, you can really lead them anywhere. Listen to the folklore, listen to the local knowledge, and indigenous culture will tell you about paleo contact. And by the time you spend any time with traditional teachers, with shamanic teachers, you'll come away believing that we live in a soup of company, that there are all kinds of beings in this cosmos. There are beings like us, flesh and bone, some of whom look very much like us, some of us who are like us but taller, some who are a bit more reptilian, and other beings that may be interdimensional, that can manifest in a way that's visible to us, but they're not three-dimensional in the same way that we are. And then there are energy-based beings that the early Christians talked about, the archons, that are parasitic type entities that always keep company with biological life because they parasite off the emotional life of those beings. And then we have other beings that we're not quite sure what they are. And you will hear this sort of agnosticism in 1 John 4 that talks about contact experiences, and in Shamanic Story Around the World. And you mentioned shadow people. This is my most recent video on the Paul Wallis channel, and I've been blown away. I think I've had about 1,500 stories of contact with shadow people shared in response to that video. And we can see that it's a spectrum of experiences, that there may be different kinds of entity that manifest as these beings that all you can see is the shape of a person in pitch black. And sometimes they'll look like they're wearing a hood. Sometimes they'll look like they're wearing a top hat. Sometimes a fedora hat. But you can't see any detail. And people's experiences range from terrifying to actually feeling safe around them. And I think there are different kinds of being that manifest in our perceptual field in that kind of way. If you have a cat or a dog, you'll probably be aware that there are entities moving around that you can't see. And as long as your cat or dog isn't worried, I wouldn't worry about it. But occasionally your dog will start barking at that thing that's moving through your room, and your cat will flare up and puff up its tail. So pet owners know about this stuff. But I think, again, it's a spectrum of entities, some nice, some not so nice, some indifferent. But as I say, once you're listening to the folkloric layer, you certainly don't believe that we're alone in this cosmos. Anxiety about the control of currency is very topical. There are lots of things afoot right now, people interested in holding their wealth in different ways so that their wealth can't be revalued by bankers or governments. And as I show in the Invasion of Eden, this is a very ancient concern. So if I go to stories that are thousands of years old, for instance, in the Hebrew canon, we have the Elohim turning up, and what do? They annex the land, they divide it among themselves, so they cancel all previous patterns of indigenous ownership. They now own it. And once they've dispossessed the people of ownership of the land, the people can't work for themselves anymore. They will now have to work for the tokens that the conquerors will give them. They have to work for the conqueror's money. So you can hear that in the Hawaiian stories of the Mo'o, who did exactly that, annexed the land, separated people from it, forced them to work for money, and then started devaluing the money so that the people have to work harder and harder for their tokens to be able to buy the things they bought last year. Well, that's the pattern everywhere. If you think about the Romans' invasion of Palestine, they invade. Now people are going to have to start doing business in the single currency of the Roman Empire, because if you're going to pay your taxes, you're going to pay it in Roman currency. Thank you very much. So you're now having to work for the conqueror's money. The conqueror mints it. The conqueror provides it. So there's no mistaking, once the Romans turn up, the only people you're working for are the Romans. You work for the people who issue the currency. Britain goes into Ghana, replaces the local currency with British pounds. You now work for British pounds. You're working for the British. And once that change has been made, you are under the power of those who issue the currency, because bit by bit, it will be devalued. You won't get any more hours in the day or days in the week. But if you still want a house, if you still want a certain standard of living, you're going to have to work harder and harder and harder to maintain it. And just to give you a shocking measure of this, between 1800 and 2023, the British pound was devalued by 99.032%. Do you really think that wage increases have kept up with that? You can bet your bottom dollar. No, they haven't. And you see it when you start comparing average incomes with the average price of a house. So in 1966, for instance, in Australia, if you wanted to buy a house, if a couple could work for 2 years on the income of one person. The income of the other person could buy a house outright, because the average house price was 1.6 times the average household income based on a single income. 1.6. So after 2 years, you could buy a house for cash. Do you think you can do that after 2 years in 2024? You certainly could not. Now it's I think something like 7.6 times the average household income, which is now based on two incomes. And we've reached the point in Australia where it is really impossible for, say, a young couple, pity you if it's only you as an individual trying to get the money for a house, a young couple is never going to be able to save the money it needs for a deposit in order to buy a house, let alone get a loan and maintain a mortgage. The new generation has been locked out unless mummy and daddy have a lot of cash they've built up as baby boomers or maybe early Gen Xers. So the devaluation of currency is a very powerful tool. It is essentially an alternative to slavery. And this was really something modeled in the society of the ancient Sumerians, who were the first culture we know about on planet Earth to come up with a money system. Again, they privatized the land and they concentrated the population in cities, pulling them out of the countryside to living in denser conditions where they're working for money, and that's gradually devalued. The Apkallu taught that to the ancestors of the Sumerians, because that is how you manage a large, dense population. Now, this is a story that was told nearly 2,000 years ago by the priest Berossus, and it's a very subtle explanation of why all around the world there are Uber policies designed to move people into cities to ensure that everyone is absolutely dependent on currency. Nobody can live off their own land. Nobody could really work for themselves, because if you can make that shift, then you're controlling people through the money system, and it's just a matter of easy management. So that's a story that's 2,000 years old, and right now people are beginning to rail against that. The Vatican doesn't look like a geopolitical player in the modern era in the way it did, say, perhaps at the time of the Reformation, the European Reformation in the 1500s. But you're right, there's still plenty of power there, plenty of wealth, plenty of information that the Vatican has about human history, human identity, information about contact, information about hidden technology. And in that sense, it's not so dissimilar to the Pentagon with all the information and the wealth that they hold. The Pentagon is bankrolled by trillions of dollars of black budgets. And in a similar way, the Vatican is supplied with huge sums of money through property ownership all around the world. Both of them have hidden technology. So they're quite similar in a lot of ways. But there was something I was going to say that brought this home for me from the 1980s when I was traveling in Brazil. I was there to study the churches. There was phenomenal grassroots growth of communities of faith in the interior that were not controlled by priests, not controlled by hierarchy. People were finding each other, having powerful spiritual experiences, and then asking the question together, how do we organize our town differently? How do we achieve a better living standard for the people of our district? And I saw that the Vatican was very upset about this and was doing everything it could to stamp this out. And the workers that were going around encouraging this, bit by bit, I worked out they were all monks and nuns. And this blew me away, because that wasn't how I thought of monks and nuns. These monks and nuns were like revolutionaries. And I thought, well, why is it them who are doing this work? And it was because there's a certain independence of the religious orders from the curia, from the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. And so I understood that the hierarchy had agreements in place with secular powers, with regional, national governments, and they had agreements that they wouldn't allow their power to be destabilized by grassroots movements. So this is a profoundly anti-democratic energy coming from the top to keep those in power for whatever benefit that flows to the Vatican. I'm not quite sure, other than that a lot of these districts are Catholic districts, and so there is a flow of wealth still in the present from Catholic countries to the Vatican. And so I was quite young when I realized the Vatican is still involved in geopolitics. It is still involved in shoring up this government and undermining this movement. I saw it in real time in Brazil in the 1980s, and it's no different today than it was then. So at the beginning of Christianity, there was a great kaleidoscope of ideas, experiences, theologies, and texts representing what Christianity was. So that included the canonical texts, and it included the pre-canonical and Gnostic texts. And so if you want to learn about beings who came and did terraforming on a devastated planet, you have to go to the Gnostic texts to hear about the craftsman or the demiurge. If you want to hear about beings that are not human, not exactly demonic, but they parasite off biological life and can manipulate politicians into behaving in a way that's more aggressive and paranoid and might lead to war, again, you have to read the Gnostic texts and read about the archons. If you want to get an idea of the range of stories that surrounded what happened to Jesus before, during, and after the cross, you have to go to the forbidden books to realize there were a number of ideas about that. Or if you go to the Hebrew canon formed roughly as we know it today in the 6th century BCE, but it was a rewrite of earlier stories of paleo contact, and they were rewritten to become a story of monotheism. Between that and the time of Jesus, there were other writings that were added that sort of were a bridge between that thinking and international thought, or Greek thought as it was known. And so some other books were written that began exploring ideas of spiritual experiences, angelic beings, demonic beings, us as eternal beings. These were new ideas. They're not in the original Hebrew canon. The idea that we might pre-exist this material experience and then go on to another kind of experience after, that was in all these new books. So they got excluded as the Hebrew canon was redefined by the Jewish community in the Christian period. And after the Reformation, the Christians limited the canon as well to get rid of some of those because those ideas were a bit too interesting. And I think one of the most interesting exclusions was in the definition of the Hebrew canon that decided the Book of Enoch wouldn't be in it. And if you want to know what's in the Book of Enoch, it's easy to find. It wasn't burned, thank goodness. It wasn't buried in the desert and lost like the Gnostic text. It was buried in the desert for its protection, because after Emperor Theodosius, non-Orthodox ideas were more or less illegal, and then it resurfaced after the Second World War. But during all that time, you could have just taken a trip to Ethiopia and read one of their Bibles, because they kept the Book of Enoch in it. Well, whether you buy one off Amazon or you go to Ethiopia and read one of their Bibles, get into the Book of Enoch, and it won't take you long before you work out why it wasn't included. And that's because it's quite developed in the ideas of what contact with non-human visitors meant in the deep past. And I've mentioned beings like Asherah, Hunhunapu, and Bob Wanarisa teaching us farming, but there's actually a rich cultural exchange described in the Book of Enoch, whereby these beings come who are described as watchers. They teach our ancestors which plants are good for food, which are good to avoid, which are good for medicines, which are good for higher consciousness. But they also teach them to dress more interestingly, to wear makeup, and to start wearing adornments. And you realize the whole human experience is being enriched by this contact. and it gives a lot more layers to the story, which is only glancingly referenced in Genesis 6 as a story of visitation and hybridization. So a lot of Christians are aware of that, and some Christians have a notion of a populated cosmos because Genesis 6 mentions these non-human hybridizers. But I love the Book of Enoch. It really is a fascinating book. It is an ancient book. It's written by an ancient person with an ancient worldview, but in the thought forms of the day, he's trying to process experiences and cultural memory using the language that he had available. We can read that today and say, I think I know what he's telling us. This is paleo contact. This is cultural exchange with another civilization that enabled our ancestors to make a massive leap forward. And it got excluded because what the empire wanted, the Roman Empire, out of Christianity and out of its canon, was a neatly ordered theocratic society where you've got God at the top, and then the emperor somewhere close to him, then the bishops and the senators in the middle, telling everyone what to do, making the laws, and then the priests and the people at the bottom just meekly paying, praying, and obeying. And what they didn't want was any suggestion that you could get an education or an understanding of the world outside of that pyramid of powers. Your only role is to believe what you're told and do what you're told. They want a slightly distressed, frightened, slightly hungry, utterly dependent population. And so this neat pyramid of powers, that's what a theocratic society should look like. That's why the canon of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, was pared down in the 6th century BCE to a story of monotheism. That's why the Gnostic text in the Book of Enoch were excluded at the beginning of Christianity, to keep the picture simple, so that obeying God and obeying the state amount to more or less the same thing.